guys, welcome to today's episode of Making History. Today we're going to chat with an attorney a little bit about the potential of liability related to printing PPE during the time of COVID. With us today we have Monica Hartsock. Monica, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Monica Hartsock, and I am a consumer protection attorney here in Southern California. My law office is based out of Chino, California. And what a consumer protection attorney does is we sue large companies that take advantage of people, consumers. We represent consumers. So because I'm the type of attorney that's out suing for liability violations, companies that do things wrong, I'm going to do my best to try to answer some of these questions through that lens.
Monica, a lot of the conversations that we've had with our makers who print PPE have had questions regarding liability and Good Samaritan laws and wondering if they print bad PPE, if they can be sued. So today we want you to kind of help us to debunk some of these myths. So if you can start by maybe helping demystify some of this vocabulary, that would be really helpful for our audience. Can you better help us understand what the difference between liability and Good Samaritan laws are?
Yeah, so, when you first called to see if I would be even able to talk on this topic, you did say Good Samaritan laws, and that kind of confused me a little bit because generally Good Samaritan laws apply if you undertake a task, a responsibility that you don't have. So you're driving down the road and you see someone going through a medical emergency, something like that, you have no legal obligation to pull over and help them. You might have an ethical and moral one, but not a legal one. So Good Samaritan laws really apply when you choose to, for the betterment of someone else, stop and intervene, insert yourself into a situation that's happening when you didn't have a legal obligation to do so. So I don't think what you're asking and what people that are asking your webinar about really means Good Samaritan. I understand why people would be using that term, but I think it's really more of a straightforward, can I be liable, which means will I have to pay anyone any money? Could I be sued if I create and hand out this PPE and it results in harm, or frankly, I think I've talked to some people that just think they could get sued just because they could get sued. And as a plaintiff's attorney that sues companies, I really want to clarify that because I see it all the time. I see it with my jurors. I see it when I'm talking to individuals. I've learned what I do. I've been called an ambulance chaser. There's a lot actually around this idea that plaintiff's attorneys just sue people for no reason or sue companies for no reason, and that reason is just greed and money, and that's just really not how it works. Generally, civil liability that I mentioned arises under someone being sued for their negligence. So as you saw at the beginning, there was a writing up, but I can't give specific legal advice, and nothing in this webinar should be construed as legal advice because the law is always very specific to your facts. It's one of the reasons I have very long consultations with clients about whether or not they have a case, because I need to learn and determine what all of the facts are, because something that might seem really minor and not an issue for my client is actually a huge issue in the eyes of the law. So none of this can be considered legal advice just because I don't have the specific facts to be able to answer specific questions about anybody who's watching this and what's going on with them. But yes, to answer your question, liability, which I mentioned, which basically means will you be responsible, will you owe something to someone else because of something you did, that arises under the legal principle, which is negligence.
Now that we understand a little bit better about the difference between liability and about Good Samaritan laws, can you explain to us what would make someone liable and why they would be liable for something?
Sure. Tying back in with this idea that I see speaking to people and friends and community members, this sort of fear that America is sue happy and there's a lot of liability issues out there. My favorite example is the McDonald's hot coffee case. Propaganda around that case and in my opinion, because I'm a plaintiff's attorney, insurance companies and large companies that don't want to be sued, they put a lot of time and a lot of effort and a lot of money into changing the narrative of some of this. And I'm not saying that there aren't bad, frivolous plaintiffs' cases, but some of them are assumed to be when they just really aren't. And McDonald's coffee case is really a good example of that. It's one that I hear people tell me often, well, you know, she bought hot coffee. What was she expecting? And some of the things people don't realize about that McDonald's case is there have been over 700 claims of people being harmed by the temperature of the McDonald's coffee over a span of 10 years before this plaintiff, who was, I think she was 78 years old. She was elderly, and she was just sitting in the passenger seat of her car, I think her son's car. She took the cap off her cup, was putting cream and sugar in it, and the cup spilled, and the coffee, which was between 180 and 190 degrees, caused third-degree burns on her inner thighs and on the top of her thighs, and she had to have skin grafts. I mean, it was really bad. It wasn't just some warm coffee being spilled on somebody. And another thing that's important, I think, for our future conversation today is it's not a secret that she only asked for her medical bills to be covered originally. She asked for $20,000 because that's what her medical bills were because of this. And McDonald's refused. They just refused to help her. They refused to pay anything. They refused to cover her medical bills. And it was a jury that decided that because McDonald's had clearly been put on notice for 10 years with over 700 claims about the temperature of this coffee, and also, McDonald's did nothing about it, and they still had in their handbook that their coffee would be served between this temperature, a temperature known to cause third-degree burns within 3 seconds of contact. The jury decided to punish McDonald's through a $3 million verdict in punitive damages. And punitive damages are an additional thing that juries have the right to award to punish a defendant. I really feel passionate about making sure people understand that there are frivolous cases out there. I'm sure there's attorneys that are out there just to make money. They're doing bad things, just like there are on the defense side, just like there is anywhere. But I think the propaganda associated with some of these cases really misleads people. And I think the McDonald's case is a really good example of that.
Keeping the McDonald's example in mind, can we build on that and help our viewers understand how liability might apply to them in the case of printing PPE with 3D printers?
Absolutely. There's a number of things that I think people should take away from McDonald's, as the McDonald's coffee case is a good example of when liability is appropriate and when it isn't. You might have noticed when I was discussing it, we had a few really serious issues here. So McDonald's was on notice. They knew their coffee was too hot, and they continued that practice. So they were out there doing something that they knew was hurting people, and they kept doing it. I can't give legal advice, and I don't know the specifics of what people who are watching this webinar are doing while they're just trying to help in this global pandemic and this real emergency for the United States dealing with COVID. But I can't imagine a scenario where someone who's interested and cares enough about themselves and about the people they're printing PPE for, that they watch this, that they're in some kind of situation where they know what they're doing is harmful and they're still doing it. That's really a big part of where you can have liability, and where I think I hopefully could resolve a few fears, because unless there's really great evidence that you know that what you're doing is hurting people and you keep doing it, I just don't see you getting sued because you're trying to help and something happened inadvertently. This sort of ties in with not lying, not knowing what you're doing is wrong. I know there was some discussion earlier in the news and stuff about medical grade fabrics and people who, for example, are making masks. If you're just getting fabric and creating masks, don't tell people it's medical grade if it isn't. So don't lie. And I don't think I don't think anybody who's watching this would go out of their way to do that. So, you want to don't mislead anybody. Don't continue doing a practice that you know will hurt someone. And that will, go really far in making sure that you don't have any problems. The other thing is, in the McDonald's coffee case, she was severely hurt. So, if cause, right? So causation is a huge part of negligence law. And if someone were to sue someone for being negligent, you have to be able to, the plaintiff, the person filing the lawsuit, bringing the lawsuit, suing the other side, has to prove that what the defendant did caused the harm that resulted. So again, with PPE equipment, unless, it comes out that the products you're using, I don't know, expose people to some kind of illness or chemical or something that makes them sick, it's really difficult to put together a cause too. So you've got to have really knowledge that what you're doing is bad. You've got to have that what you're doing is actually bad. It's actually causing harm to someone. And, I just don't see that with PPE stuff. But again, I don't know all the facts. So if someone were to call my office with more specific facts, I'd be able to give, better thoughts.
Are there any other potential issues you can think of regarding printing open source materials?
I'm a bit of a control freak, which is a reason I'm a trial attorney. I like to know everything that's going on. I like to know where everything traces back to and things. So, if you're using open source materials, then you want to make sure that they're good, that they're complete, that they're doing what they're going to do, because I don't see any sort of difference on any of the liability issues we talked to just because something's out as open source. If you're printing some PPE that's not going to help people or is somehow going to harm them. And again, I can't see how something would harm them. But if you did, you're not going to have some kind of defense to a claim like that because it was open source. One of the things with open source, just that I see often, and this might not be an issue in this community, but you really want to be careful because people have spent a lot of time and put a lot of effort into these designs. And when they're sharing them, generally they don't intend them to be shared for people to make a commercial enterprise out of their plans. So you always want to make sure that you know how it was shared. And there's going to be some different rules probably about whether you can use those plans to create something that you're going to donate versus selling for a profit. So I would just say keep an eye on stuff like that.
Now that we know a little bit more about what could potentially open someone up to a liability suit, what are some ways that people can cover themselves just to make sure that they aren't liable?
Anitra, that's a really good question. And it feels a lot like a question that asks me to have a crystal ball that can give some amazing advice that if you just do what I say in the next sentence, you'll be completely fine. And I don't have that power. I wish I had that power. I would like that power, but I don't have that power. What I can say is going back to the elements that we already talked about, and the really important one being don't lie. Don't say that your fabric is medical grade or that your filter is of a certain quality or something like that if it isn't. And when you're talking about steps that people can take to sort of protect themselves further or just make sure that they're being as forthcoming as possible with their information and making sure that there's no way that there could be a misunderstanding, there is the option of, say, just disclosing stuff. Tell the people who have bought or are receiving the donated items that it's not medical grade. It doesn't hurt to just include like a little sheet of paper that says this isn't medical grade or discloses the other information that you know about the product that you think the user might want to know. So there's, straight up lying, which is bad. Like get that from this call or this webinar. Just like when you were in kindergarten, lying is bad. But On the side of really trying to protect yourself, you're going to see more disclosures, making things clear, clarifying stuff so that the recipient doesn't have a misunderstanding. You know, it doesn't hurt to go ahead and disclose information that you do know that you think that your ultimate user would want to have.
Thanks, Monica, for helping us better understand the world of liability and printing PPE. I have another question for you. What are you doing now during COVID as a consumer protection attorney?
So as things are opening back up, we're seeing a lot of issues where consumers are dealing with their finances, with cars. Cars were not supposed to be repossessed during this time. Repossessions were not an essential service, so we're seeing some wrongful repossessions. We're seeing some debt collection companies trying to take stimulus payments. We're seeing mortgage companies agreeing to a 3-month forbearance, but on day 91 claiming they have to have all of the money or they will go foreclose on someone's house. And logically, if you're offering a forbearance, then you don't get to go foreclose on day 91. That's really no help at all. So we're really seeing a lot of things coming out of this where consumers just need some help. And my passion project always surrounds debt shame. And I see that people, for example, might be more willing to joke around about like a DUI that they got or something else that is arguably embarrassing before they would admit that they missed a credit card payment or they're behind on their finances. And right now in this time when people are having a hard time keeping their jobs and they've been furloughed or their job structures changed, that's just happening. People don't have the resources and there's a lot of shame associated with it. And I think that's really sad because it's outside of someone's control. You know, no one caused themselves to be fired because their company closed during COVID. And if they can't make their credit card payments or they can't continue moving forward the way they were, I hate the fact that people are suffering in silence about this shame and the stress associated with it. So that's what my office really focuses on. We try to help people with that. A lot of times someone will call and they'll tell me just the horrible things that a debt collector is doing, calling them deadbeats or calling from an automated dialer and the phone will ring 5 times and then there's no one there. And then they call right back and the phone calls come like 3 or 4 times in a row just to harass someone. And I mean, it's just horrible. And I'll say, oh, you know, that they're not allowed to do that legally. And people on the phone are like, they're not allowed to do that. And I'm like, no, they're not allowed to do that. So I encourage people to talk about it more and realize they're not alone. If you just do some Google searches, there's a really high percentage. I think it's about 75% of Americans don't have 6 months of savings set aside. And then, of course, the other like 25%, they have years. So there's no division, right? But the majority of us are just trying to get by. And that's what my firm really focuses on. We sue car dealerships that take advantage of people with poor credit scores, repossess cars when they shouldn't, have ridiculously high interest rates, lie when they're selling the car. You know, the very typical bought a car and a week later the engine died and the dealership says, too bad, you have to pay us still, and things like that. So my passion project always is this whole debt shaming world and how I hate the idea that consumers are out there dealing with this. And you know, there's people even committing suicide because of it. And that's just heartbreaking. But we are seeing significantly more issues with now that COVID, things are, COVID's, I mean, it's not over, but the banks are reopening and things like that are happening. So we're focusing a lot on that.
If any of our viewers today need some consumer protection assistance, how can they get help from you?
My website, which is www.hartsocklawfirm.com, has a client intake form, and that is the best way to reach me. I hear clients say often, well, I just picked up the phone and called, but I'm usually doing things, my paralegals are busy doing things. So the best way to reach me is to fill out the client intake form on the website at hartsocklawfirm.com. It gets emailed directly to me. I look over it as soon as I can and set up a time for you to chat with my paralegal and figure out what's going on. And we sue mortgage companies, student loan lenders, debt collectors, car dealerships, not usually many insurance companies, but basically if you think you're being defrauded, if you think someone's lying to you, you want to reach out. Oh, and also we're seeing a lot in COVID too, errors on your credit report. So if your credit card's being posted to your credit report as missing a payment, but you had a forbearance for COVID, that's an issue and something my firm can help you clean up and possibly bring a case about.
At the end of every episode, we're asking our interviewees to recommend their favorite podcast to us, what they're listening to right now. Monica, what should everyone be listening to?
Well, I'm embarrassed to state that I don't really know podcasts and I don't really know how to make the app work. Anitra, I'm going to call you later and have you talk me through it. But I do have Facebook because I'm a Gen Xer. And on Facebook, there's a group called Law Zebra, and it's LAWZEBRA, and it's Law Zebra. It's a collective of consumer protection attorneys across the United States. I'm a member, and they post some really great updates and information about consumer protection law that people just don't realize they have. Again, that whole like, oh, the bank's not allowed to do that. No, the bank's not allowed to do that. So I encourage everyone to follow Law Zebra on Facebook.
Monica, thank you again so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
It was wonderful getting to chat with you and learn a little bit more about liability. Take care, and for everyone else, until next time, keep making history.